Sí.
Perfecto. Ya te oigo perfectamente. Si os parece, nada, lo que os comentaba, comenzamos el webinar de hoy.
Bien. Bueno, buenos días y bienvenidos. Bienvenidos a todos a este nuevo ciclo. Es una novedad, es un ciclo de seminarios web preparados para las fundaciones corporativas que tiene el objetivo de difundir conocimiento, pero también permitir interacción. Por eso se llama Conecta y Pregunta. Es un lujo tener hoy en este seminario web a Paul Street, que es el director general de la Fundación Lloyds Bank, pero también nos acompaña la responsable de filantropía de ANESBAT, Ana Loenberg, que es una organización que ha decidido apoyar el ciclo, Silverio Gea, director general de la Asociación Española de Fundaciones, Rosa Gallego, directora de Relaciones Internacionales, Consejos Autonómicos y Finanzas, y un minuto, 2 minutos para comentar un poco la dinámica, dado que este es un ciclo, pero hoy lo que tenemos es un tema que es las implicaciones de la estrategia Covid-19 en la estrategia de la Fundación Lloyds Bank, que será en inglés, será impartido en inglés, una presentación que según el programa parece que va a ser 40 minutos y luego 40 minutos de preguntas. Hablando con Paul, hemos visto que es mejor fragmentar el tema de la presentación en 2 bloques. La primera parte sería sobre el contexto del sector fundacional del Reino Unido, la estrategia de la Fundación Lloyds Bank y sus relaciones con el socio corporativo, serían 20 minutos. Ahí habrá un turno de preguntas. Las preguntas se hacen por el chat, puede ser en español o en inglés, y nosotros las planteamos en inglés. En el primer bloque lo haré yo, en el segundo bloque lo hará Rosa, a Paul Street. Entonces, esto va a ser más dinámico, no va a ser un bloque 40 y 40, sino va a ser 20, 20, 20, 20, y así es como va a ser la presentación, que vais a ver que es una presentación con mucho contenido y que va a ir un poco rápido. No os preocupéis porque os la vamos a compartir al acabar el seminario web junto a la grabación, un par de días más tarde. Y nada más. Pues cuando quieras, Silverio.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo. Bueno, bienvenido a todos y a todas, bienvenido a todas las personas que estáis inscritas en este seminario que tiene un título súper sugerente, Conecta y Pregunta, y especialmente bienvenido y agradecimiento a Paul Street, que es uno de los 25 líderes más influyentes del Reino Unido, por lo tanto, persona que controla perfectamente el tema que va a exponer. Muchas gracias también a ANESBAT, muchas gracias Ana por apoyar esta iniciativa de colaboración con la asociación, y muchas gracias Eduardo y muchas gracias Rosa, porque gracias a vosotros dos, la idea de Rosa y luego el apoyo de Eduardo, gracias a vosotros dos es posible este seminario, que es continuidad prácticamente de lo que venía haciendo Rosa los 5 años anteriores, conectando a las fundaciones también a nivel europeo, intentando constantemente que las fundaciones que estáis al otro lado de la pantalla fuera y a los encuentros europeos, ¿no? Creemos que compartir experiencias, evidentemente, no solo a nivel español, sino a nivel europeo, es clave para construir de una forma acertada el sector. Así es que, de verdad, muchas gracias a todos los que habéis hecho posible este seminario nuevo y este nuevo ciclo de seminarios, ¿no? Bueno, decir que las fundaciones corporativas, que todas las fundaciones hoy en día son importantes, y más después de la crisis o dentro de la propia crisis en la que estamos, es algo obvio. Es decir, que las fundaciones corporativas son importantes y además que están en alza a nivel global, es obvio, pero no porque sea obvio debemos dejar de decirlo. Creo que si miramos la financiación del sector fundacional, nos damos cuenta claramente de la apuesta de las empresas por fundaciones. Basta con decir que más del 30% de los recursos que tienen las fundaciones, de esos 8.000 millones de euros que manejan las fundaciones a nivel español, vienen directamente de las empresas, y mucha parte de ellas de las empresas a través de sus fundaciones. Por lo tanto, creo que es una realidad obvia, que está creciendo, que hay que apoyar, y para eso también estamos aquí, ¿no? Pero los 2 minutos que quiero perder a continuación tiene que ver con las estrategias COVID y sobre todo ya con las estrategias post-COVID, ¿no? Ha sido interesantísimo la escucha activa, llamémoslo así, que hemos tenido desde la asociación con todos los socios. En esa escucha activa hemos sabido, yo creo, interpretar los retos que nos estáis marcando, ¿no? Y lo que nos sale de los retos es que, evidentemente, tras el COVID y en el COVID, las fundaciones nos enfrentamos, todas en general, pero en particular las fundaciones corporativas, evidentemente, a un reto de salud. Hemos estado en una emergencia sanitaria. Y hay que decir que muchas fundaciones corporativas han hecho aportaciones extras, claramente, y colaboraciones, perdón, y colaboraciones extras para apoyar la crisis sanitaria, ¿no? Pero como bien sabéis, no solo hablamos de una crisis sanitaria, sino que hablamos de una crisis económica mucho más virulenta probablemente que la del 2008. Esta crisis sanitaria viene acompañada evidentemente de la crisis económica y que lleva a marcar otro reto, que es el reto social. O sea, hemos vuelto a ver imágenes que no pensábamos, gente en colas para recibir alimentos, tema que yo creo que se estaba intentando totalmente erradicar, ¿no? Y que vuelve desgraciadamente a verse en ciudades como Madrid, ¿no? Por lo tanto, reto no solo sanitario, sino sociosanitario, porque hay una parte social también consecuencia de esta crisis económica. El reto de la brecha digital es algo que no ha salido por todos lados. La igualdad de oportunidades viene también ahora si luchamos contra la brecha digital y el acceso para todos los ciudadanos y especialmente para los jóvenes y para los niños, el acceso a la educación es clave, por lo tanto, brecha digital. Y algo que sale con mucha fuerza en las consultas que hemos hecho a las fundaciones es el tema del desempleo. Evidentemente, una crisis económica viene acompañada de desempleo. Las tasas que se atisban de desempleo son muy altas, por lo tanto, ahí también tenemos un reto grande, lo que son las fundaciones corporativas en particular y las fundaciones en general, ¿no? Pero hay otro reto que hemos puesto encima de la mesa desde la propia asociación, y es el reto de lo que hemos venido a denominar salvar tejido asociativo, salvar tejido fundacional. Evidentemente, las fundaciones son clave en la lucha contra la crisis, son clave en la atención a los fines de interés general, y si de esta caen fundaciones, y permitidme esa expresión, tendremos menos tejido que atiende a esos retos que tenemos que hacer frente, ¿no? Por lo tanto, tan importante como atender a los retos es intentar que el tejido social, que el tejido asociativo, que el tejido fundacional no caiga, porque de esta forma podrán hacerse cargo de los problemas y de las dificultades. En síntesis, lo que os intento decir es que las fundaciones en general y las fundaciones corporativas en particular nos enfrentamos a los retos de siempre, a la actividad de siempre, pero acrecentada por una crisis sanitaria que viene acompañada de una crisis económica con un tema social fuerte, con un tema de desempleo fuerte y de brecha digital, que para cumplir esa máxima que decimos que donde hay una necesidad hay una fundación, pues tendremos que seguir trabajando de una manera, y con esto acabo, de una manera conjunta. Siempre se dice que es el momento de la sociedad civil, pero ahora más que nunca hay que decir que es el momento de la sociedad civil. Y siempre se dice que es el momento de colaborar, pero justamente cuando hay más dificultades y cuando hay más necesidades es cuando hay más que colaborar. Por lo tanto, mi agradecimiento a todos los que estáis al otro lado de la pantalla, mi agradecimiento a Paul, a Ana, a Rosa y a Eduardo por organizar este seminario, porque es el momento, insisto, de atender colaborando a los fines de interés general. Muchas gracias. Y tiene la palabra Ana. Estás mutada. Ahora.
Ya está Ana, ya está Ana.
Vale. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Soy Ana Lovember, responsable de filantropía de la Fundación ANESBAD. Quisiera, en primer lugar, agradecer a la Asociación Española de Fundaciones la oportunidad y la implicación que han tenido en la organización y coordinación de este webinar, que, como dice Silverio, llega en el momento adecuado. También, por supuesto, quisiera agradecer a nuestro speaker, a Paul Street. Thank you very much for being with us today, sharing your knowledge and your expertise. Thank you. Y, por supuesto, a todos los participantes, los que están hoy al otro lado de la pantalla, efectivamente, con ganas de comprender, de ver que hay otras realidades y cómo podemos aplicarlas a nuestro quehacer diario. Para los que no conocéis la Fundación ANSBAT, os diré que la Fundación nació hace 52 años en Bilbao y hoy se dedica a luchar por el derecho a la salud en países de África subsahariana. Esta lucha por el derecho a la salud se hace siempre fortaleciendo los sistemas públicos de salud. Por lo tanto, trabajamos en colaboración muy estrecha con los ministerios de salud de los países donde estamos y de la mano también de las ONGs locales. Y el objetivo por el cual hoy estamos aquí y queremos crear este espacio de diálogo y este espacio de colaboración es porque creemos que nos enfrentamos a unos retos muy poderosos, que algunos de ellos los ha ido ya enumerando Silverio, y que nos hacen tener que unirnos para poder de verdad llegar a soluciones reales. Evidentemente el tema de la salud es algo que hemos todos podido vivir durante estos 4 meses que son muy difíciles y lo que nos queda por delante, pero tenemos también otros retos sociales, económicos y también retos medioambientales, el cambio climático, la desigualdad que antes hemos comentado, la brecha digital, el acceso a un trabajo digno, el desarrollo económico de una manera sostenible. Todos estos retos deberemos afrontarlos, además, en un espacio de 10 años. Sería ideal si los unimos con los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Y todo esto siempre será más fácil, más eficaz, más rápido si lo realizamos de manera conjunta. Por lo tanto, este espacio pretende ser un lugar donde dialoguemos, donde discutamos. Por eso les invito a que participen en esta charla que va a dar Paul para poder llegar a soluciones a los problemas que nos planteamos. Estos 4 meses de pandemia aquí en España han puesto de manifiesto que las alianzas son posibles y han surgido alianzas de manera muy rápida y además con resultados muy eficaces. Hemos visto cómo el sector empresarial asistía a las administraciones públicas y traía material sanitario. Hemos visto cómo muchas fundaciones corporativas contribuían a que esa brecha digital fuera menor y los niños pudieran acceder a la educación. Hemos visto cómo grandes empresas también se juntaban con asociaciones de vecinos para que los mayores pudieran tener acceso a comida. Hemos visto, ya digo, alianzas insólitas en muy breve espacio de tiempo y con resultados increíbles. Por lo tanto, deberíamos ser capaces de aprovechar este impulso para seguir colaborando y poder así solucionar estos retos a los que aludía Silverio y acabo de mencionar. Desde aquí, esto es una pequeña semilla para contribuir a esa especie de diálogo y esperemos que sea el primer webinar de una larga serie de webinars y también de seminarios presenciales, que poco a poco podamos encontrarnos cara a cara y poder así conocernos mejor y poder llegar a hacer proyectos comunes que den solución a todos esos retos que nos planteamos. No quiero extenderme más, le doy la palabra a Rosa, a quien le agradezco mucho el trabajo, igual que a Eduardo, por hacer posible este seminario y muchísimas gracias a todos. Rosa, cuando quieras.
Muchas gracias, Ana. Y bueno, pues buenos días a todos y a todas. Y aquí es donde hacemos la transición al idioma. Good morning, everyone, and I would like to say especially good morning to Paul, who's been silently listening to all of us for the last 10 minutes when we've been doing the introduction to this seminar. Good morning, Paul. How are you? I'm afraid we are not. Yes. Hello.
Hear me?
Yes. I think we'll listen to you now. Yeah. Hello. How are you, Paul?
Buenos dias, Rosa. Nice to be here.
Buenos dias. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. We are very glad, as it's been previously said, but I translated for you, that you are our first speaker, that you are the first speaker in this seminar series for corporate foundations, or about corporate foundations, I would better say, that we have named Connect and Ask. And as we've already said, we are very pleased and honored to have you as our first speaker in this seminar series. I will not go into telling who is Paul Streets, because you have all received a brief presentation. I will just like to say that you're probably aware of the intense and impressive career he's developed in the voluntary and in the public sector. So all that knowledge is part of what he's doing now as the CEO of Lloyds Bank Foundation. I would say I had the opportunity to meet Paul back in 2017, and I think that was in Zurich, in the European Corporate Foundations Knowledge Exchange that we co-organize with DAFNE, our umbrella organization in Europe. And those exchanges have been happening for the last 5 years, and I think we met in several of them. They're a good opportunity to learn what other foundations are doing in Europe, what are the trends, what are the challenges. We have had some Spanish foundations participating on those exchanges too. But we thought it was not enough to give our members the opportunity to go to a knowledge exchange once a year somewhere around Europe. But we thought it was a good idea to bring speakers to our members and the foundation sector here in Spain. We thought to have been doing this in Madrid at the beginning of April. That was our initial idea, and we should have met all in person and have a good time and a good talk. But of course, that could not be possible at that time, and it's not yet possible. So I'm very happy that you agreed that we moved to this online format. So we don't wait anymore, because nothing waits and nothing stops. All in the contrary, we are all now, under the threat of the speed and the emergency. And this is the reason why we decided to change the format, left the in-person meeting for whenever it's possible, and then start with these online seminars. Paul, I will thank you in advance for being aware that English is not our first language for many of us. I know you have a lot of things to share, but I will really love if you can, take a little breath when speaking, to make sure people can follow you, because I know the presentation is going to be extraordinarily interesting. And without further ado, I leave it all to you, and we are all ears, if we can say that in English. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Rosa, and buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not with you in Madrid. My only consolation is that the temperature in Britain at the moment is probably the same as Madrid. I think it's 33 outside today. So this is going to take you on a journey. It's a journey that when Rosa and I first spoke is different, because initially I was going to talk only about strategy in a corporate foundation. But obviously, since then, the world has moved on, and we've divided this into two parts. The first part is to talk very broadly about strategy. And in that, I will take you on a journey, really, a journey for us of 7 years, beginning with 2013 and running through to today. That's part one, if you like. And at the end, I will end with some reflections, which might lead us to some questions. There'll be a lot of data on these slides, and you will get those slides after this presentation, I understand. The data is less important than the approach. I'm trying to describe an approach. The data is specific to us. The approach isn't. I hope that many of the things I'll share with you would be useful or valuable for anybody in your position as leaders in foundations trying to set strategy. So that's the first part. And it would be remiss, of course, not to focus on COVID. So Rosa and I, when I spoke to Eduardo and Rosa, we agreed that we would divide it into two parts. And part two is looking specifically at COVID and how, as a foundation, we're responding to that. And actually, interestingly, in the context of that first part, the implications for our strategy. So I'm going to move on. The first 5 slides are just data on the foundation sector in the UK to give you some context. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm not going to go through the data in huge amounts of detail. I'll give you the headlines, really, just to set some context for you. But we begin in earnest in slide 7 or 8, but I'll flip through these very quickly. So this first slide just gives you a sense of the size of the foundation sector in the UK context. So as you can see, we're about 4.4 billion, which is UK sterling, which is probably something like 5 billion euros in terms of the size of the sector. And that's the areas that we spend money on. And I know that many of you are operating foundations. There's a big difference in the UK in that the bulk of foundations are not operating foundations. They are funding foundations. And we are of that type. So I'm going to talk about that. So if I move on here, this is the share of giving by foundation type. So you'll see the different types of funding. The dark blue box family foundations, you'll have many of those in Spain, I'm sure. you will see that corporate foundations make up a very small proportion of these. And probably like the sector in Spain, where the sector is dominated by the top 300 foundations. I think there are 4,000 foundations in Britain, but the top 300 account for 40% of the spend. Moving on, looking at this data is slightly old now. We spend slightly more than this, but this is the top 10 corporate foundations by giving in the UK. This data is 2016. It changes slightly, but you'll see there are some organizations with a significant European presence here, like Vodafone, like Shell, BHP, Fidelity, I think will also have a European context. But we need to put all foundation giving, and if I go back to that first slide of all foundation giving, put it in the context of what total giving is within the UK. And foundation giving relative to government spending is tiny, and relative to the UK economy is tiny. And that's relevant to what I will say about strategy, because a lot of our focus is on leverage. How can we create the greatest influence, given that we know we don't have enough resources to fix all these issues ourselves? So if I move on now and look at UK private giving by source, you will see that's the total amount of UK private giving to the voluntary sector, to charities in Britain. And you see the bulk of that is individuals. And again, foundations, the top 300 foundations make up a relatively small proportion of that. That's the blue box there, 3.3 billion. So foundations are an important part of giving to charities in the UK, but they're not the only part, and they're not the most important part. So I'll move on now into the strategy process at the foundation. As I say, I'm going to take you on a journey, and I'm going to take you right back to 2013 and talk about what we have found useful. And as I say, I think the data is less important than the approach that we've used, which I hope will be relevant to each of you in your own foundations. So I arrived at the foundation in 2013, and we asked these questions about why are we there, what are we there for, and how do we best function? And we started in 2013 by looking out and looking at external research. We effectively did what you might call a competitor analysis. We looked at what other funders were doing. We looked at the external environment. We asked ourselves what we were doing well. We asked our grantees, and a big focus of our approach is asking those that we fund, how good are we, or how bad are we? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? How can that then shape what we do? So our start point was to look out and look in, but then take our trustees, and you're probably the same in Spain. I'm governed by a board of 12 trustees, and in the end, they make decisions on what we do. We advise them. But one of the key things you need to do, from my perspective, is to force trustees to make choices about what they will do. There's a recurring theme throughout this will be focus, focus, focus. I think too often foundations try to be everything to everybody and end up being nothing to anybody. So we have tried to focus, and we've used a series of tools, and here's the tools will be valuable. This is a tool we found really useful. Effectively, if we're dealing with issues that, the big three issues that we fund are mental health, domestic abuse, and homelessness, but we also, for example, fund work with refugees, people who are a long way from the labour market. One of the big questions for us is, where do you intervene on this curve? Do we intervene at the top, where we have to intervene at a population level, work with whole communities to try to prevent things happening in the first place? Do we intervene at the bottom of the cliff, where people already have serious problems and the cost is likely to be high? Or do we sit somewhere in the middle, trying to create break points? We're really in the middle, in that middle break. Our point for me is not that any of these three areas are good or bad. So actually trying to do all of them probably is wrong. And we have decided to focus on that middle bit. Our job is to try to help organizations that support people from falling to the bottom of the cliff. If I move on, one of the things we found really useful, and we stole this from the ACF, which is our equivalent of your Spanish foundation, Association, is to ask your board and your staff, where do they sit on these spectrums? And these are opposites deliberately. And we did an exercise, the lines in purple, or when we asked our staff, where did they think we were? The lines in darker blue or green on the right, or where they thought we should be. And we did this as a very early process of strategy making. Are we about providing grants? Are we an agent of change? Are we going to provide a lot of grants or provide few? I won't go through each in detail. I think it's a really useful tool we used. Critically, evaluation approach. Do we really want to be focused on evaluation, or are we more interested in output? A very, very live debate. Is it about input or output? Are we going to collaborate, or are we going to not? I found that a really useful tool with our trustees to help them to think through where we are currently, where we want to be. And I'm going to return to this slide later on to demonstrate where we've headed. The other useful tool that we find incredibly valuable, and we did in 2013, was to do what I'm sure you all recognize. Anybody who's done any basic strategy training will understand a SWOT. And we did a SWOT, a strengths analysis, a weakness analysis, looking at the organization internally. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And then looking externally. What are the opportunities we face? What are the threats that we face? Now, we've populated this for us. It would be different for each of you. It'll be different over time. And again, I will return to this later on in the presentation to show how much this has changed. But in 2013, this was a tool we found incredibly valuable to help us think through what we thought we were good at, bad at, what the opportunities were, frankly, what the threats were, and where we were weak. So where did that land us? When we've done this analysis in 2013, it landed us with a program that focused both on what we fund, but also how we fund. Because we recognized that when we looked at the environment in which the voluntary sector charities in Britain were operating in 2013, which is 7 years ago, seems a long time ago, given COVID, actually one of the biggest issues facing them is they needed not just support for what they do, they needed support to do it better. And they needed longer term support. So the big switch we made was in a strategy which then was our new focus in 2013. First of all, focusing on particular issues, and we've highlighted those particular issues on the left: homelessness, mental health, substance abuse. On the right, the compounding issues that almost all the people on the left are faced with: illiteracy, lack of employment, debt issues. And what we try to do is hit that point right in the middle of these three circles of Venn diagram you recognize. We want to be right in the middle of that circle. Can we reach these people who are facing homelessness and mental health, who also are compounding issues of debt? And can we really reach those transition points? That was our target. And I'm going to share with you some of the data of where we got in terms of looking at that. But it wasn't just where to focus, it was how we would focus. And we created 3 different programs, and they're quite different. Invest for us was the investment in individual organizations. We currently fund around 700 charities in Britain. There's a larger number at that point, and I'll share with you that. To fund them for longer, to give them up to £25,000 a year for up to 6 years. But not just to look at funding them for their core work, their reach to clients, if you like, but also to help them in terms of their organization development support through a program called Enable, where they could decide they wanted to fund particular things and we would back them to do it, or Enhance, which for us sat alongside the grant. It wasn't a requirement to say, we're going to give you this grant. Alongside that grant, how can we help you to develop as an organization? And I'll talk to you more about that because these were as conceived, and we'll show about how we deliver. So if we move on, we also recognized, and I showed you at the early part of this presentation, the fact that foundations, and our foundation in particular, are only a tiny part of addressing the issues we're trying to address, which are deep social issues in society across the UK. So we ought to determine to focus on influencing the wider environment. So we set ourselves a policy objective. And in deciding again where to focus on that, we looked at what you'll recognize as a classic 2x2. For anybody who's done an MBA, you'll recognize them. Where are we going to make the greatest impact on the left? And where will we make a unique contribution, and focusing on sweet spots? And I'll talk about what that's going to learn. So this was back in 2013. And I want you to fast forward to 2018, when we revisited the strategy and asked, have we made a difference? And the next set of slides will ask that question. So did we make a difference? Well, first of all, did we reach the right places? And this is England and Wales. We only funded England and Wales, obviously Scotland, Northern Ireland too, but we don't fund in them. We have made a pretty good difference in spreading our resources across a very wide range of areas, which was objective 1. The second was, were we funding the right kinds of issues? And you can see on this, we had managed to fund quite a lot of unemployment, or that's become an issue for us. I might want to touch on that in the questions. We've reached homelessness, we've focused on domestic abuse. We were hitting the right kinds of issues. But success rates at panel were quite interesting if you look at those on the right. Where we were most focused, but it's very clear what we were focusing, and why I talk a lot about focus, we've got the high success rates at panel. And failure at panel for me is failure of the foundation, in that the charity has put forward a lot of effort to put an application in. You've spent a lot of effort assessing them, and they still haven't got any resources. It's a waste of effort. So we looked for very high success rates as a measure of our own success and our own organizational competence. We then asked ourselves, has it shifted? And this is the same categories again. And with the blue line, you look at where we were with the new program, the green line with where we are with the old program. So we had seen that shift in the directions that we wanted. as the slide illustrates, 5 years on. We also asked the question of, were we funding, next slide, have we funded fewer for longer? One of our objectives, as you recall, was to fund larger organizations. You can see how the strategy is played out. When we look at the benchmark, which was 2011 to 2014 data, at that time, the majority of our grants, the average size was just under £25,000. The bulk of them were 2-year grants. By 2014 to 17, which was our objective, we had shifted where the average grant size for the larger grants was £62,000. In other words, almost 3 times the size. And we had moved much more to longer term funding. But we were funding too much projects, and we've looked at that in our future strategy by shifting towards unrestricted funding. So that's the question of, how do we fund it as we wished? You recall we said we focused both on what organizations do with their core work, but also how we can support their organizational needs. Had we done that? Well, since 2014, we've done a lot of work to support people with what we call the Funder Plus model of providing them with support beyond the grant. And that's translated into a very wide range of offers, which actually is really, if you like, it's a diagnostic of the needs of charities working in the UK. We fund organizations with a turnover less than £1 million, that's about 1.2 million euros, so they're quite small local organizations. This was the range of things that they asked for us to provide and the range of things we developed to meet their needs. You'll recall I talked about, did we get beyond grant making to influence the wider environment? And I'll turn to that. But before I do that, so we published this actually on our website. You'll find a summary of that work around Funder Plus. And if you're working to fund small local organizations, whether frankly in Spain or in London, I would suggest that many of them will need the organization development support. How to do that right as a grant maker is a real challenge. And this, I hope, is a valuable document with some headlines from 5 years of learning from us, which you'll find on our website. So did we influence more widely? Well, this is some evidence of some of the influence we've had more widely. I won't go to each turn, but we asked the question of, we've published a lot of documents around domestic abuse, but more importantly, we fund a lot of work around domestic abuse. We have championed small local charities. We have funded really innovative work drawn from our grant making to focus on the perpetrators of domestic abuse. Very contentious work. Funders can do quite contentious, risky work. We have chosen to fund one of the riskiest areas possible. How do we stop prevention of domestic abuse in the home? We do it by focusing on those who are the perpetrators. And we funded really pioneering that as part of our policy work. And if we summarize all that, take it from our annual report in 2018, this gives a kind of a metric summary, like it's by number of the numbers of people who reached the kinds of outcomes we were looking for. So that's the kind of summary. So now we fast forward to 2018, only 2-3 years ago. We asked ourselves, where do we go next? And this is before COVID, remember, and we'll talk about COVID once we've broken and ask take some questions from you. Where do we head next? We went back again and we looked at what's happening in that wider environment, and we summarize it here. We still have a huge amount of poverty in Britain, which is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's shocking, actually, we have the degree of poverty we have. We still have rough sleeping. We still have a very high level of demand for the organizations that we fund. But increasingly, they're under huge pressure in that their income is falling. In particular, in some of the poorer parts of Britain, you recognize exactly the same. Madrid comparing to poorer parts of Spain, I'm sure. Actually, the demand is much higher outside, for example, of London, where there are a number of charities. You get to the northeast of England or Wales, we find a very high demand with charities really under pressure. So that was the context as the start point again to revisit the strategy in 2018. And you will recall that diagram that from the previous set. That was where we were in 2013. We did the same thing again, and we asked ourselves, where are we in 2018? And it's quite a different look, actually. And we've looked at this again with COVID. Some of the things that we were weak at, we were not good at, but we were much better at. But actually, there were still things that we needed to get right. We were not creating great enough leverage from the bank. The context in terms of the threats to charities was even greater than it was 5 years ago. So that framed what we would do next. And we went back again to that document, and you recognize it before. It's exactly the same slide. It's different colors, so like that. I don't know why it's different colors, but never mind. Where were we then? And the blue signs on the left were where we thought we had been in 2013. The yellow was where we thought we were in 2018. But the green was, if you like, the aspiration. This is an incredibly valuable document we found. And it's a really interesting thing to do this with your grantees, to do it with your staff, and to do it with your trustees, and see if they align. very different perspectives. And one of the common questions that most staff will say in foundations is, we can't be risk-taking because our trustees don't want to take risk. We have found exactly the opposite is true. Our trustees want us to take more risk, and that's what we try to do in the strategy going forwards. So where did that land us in 2018, pre-COVID, which is the strategy we began the end of then? We published a new strategy, again, this is on our website, for the next 4 years. We clarified, really building on the last 5 years, what are we there for? We talked about partnership. We're trying to move to a partnership model with the organizations we fund. We talked about being more than just funder. And we talked about building on some of the policy and practice. And we translated that into, again, the good old Venn diagram. But we now are very clear we do 3 things. We fund, we give grants that help to deliver need. We develop, we support organizations to develop their own capacity, and we try to influence the local system in which they work. And we try to influence the third circle, the wider environment in which we operate. And we've headlined those, sorry, down, into this. I can see all of this slide. On my slide, I can only see slide and part of it, but I assume you can see it all. We've headlined this into the key activities we would want to look at. If you like, that becomes our operating plan for the next 4 years. So, and we can look at where we've headed with that later on as we talk. So this is where we're heading, and it will change with COVID, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But before I close this section and move on to thinking about COVID and take some questions and reflections, just a moment for corporate foundations. I know a number of you are corporate foundations. And again, a tool we have found with our corporates, very useful, is a question of where you sit on this corporate spectrum, your relationship with it. From, on the one hand, being respectfully distanced, keep off of our lawn. We want to do this work alone. We really don't want to work with you. So highly strategic. Again, none of those positions is a wrong place to be, but actually having that as a framework, say just where we want to be, where does our corporate want to be in terms of that relationship, on the right or the left? Having that tool to actually have that conversation for us has been very helpful. And I did want to share with you some of EPA's own data on this. EVA, we've been part of an initiative with the European Venture Philanthropy Association, which is an umbrella group of European organizations like us. Rosa is a part of it, I think. She is, because that's why the corporate initiative was there. They've done some quite interesting work, which is on the slides, and I think really helpful. They're thinking about types of alignment between the corporate foundation and the corporate. And I'll share with you one of their slides where they draw a distinction between non-material alignment on the left and thematic alignment, where it's probably somewhere around there, to industry alignment or organizational alignment on the right. It's a really useful framework to think and have the conversation with your corporate about where do you sit on that spectrum? Where might you be now? Where might you want to be? We would see ourselves somewhere around non-material thematic. We don't want to be completely in bed with the corporate, but we do want to work with the corporate where it makes sense. And for example, we've done a lot of work around domestic abuse, where actually the corporate has also translated that. We work with a big bank, one of the 5th largest retail banks, the largest retail bank actually in Britain, and they're interested in how much domestic abuse affects the people who come through their doors, but also how much it affects their staff. They have 70,000 staff. So we've helped them to think through how domestic abuse is dealt with in their customer base, in their staff base. Really helpful, and actually great for charities that we work to be able to bring that voice right to the bank to help them think of this corporate strategy. And I'll share with you a couple of other slides from the EVPA because they show about where corporates currently are and where they want to be in a European context. This is looking at 58 corporates and sets out in the green box where these corporates think they are now and where they may wish to be. Again, the next slide. That's my final slide. So finally, and I'll leave with this, and Rosa, I'm very happy to take some questions at this point. These are some of the questions I think we have had to ask ourselves as we go forward in strategy, and would perhaps help for you. What are the change drivers for you? Foundations, we get our money from heaven, we just have to spend it. Our customers are those we fund. They can't walk away from us because they need our money. They're not going to walk away from us. They always tell you you're fantastic. They love you because you come with money. Why wouldn't they love you? They're not going to tell you if you're bad at what you do. So where do you get the change drivers? Choice, really tough. It's very easy foundations to try to be everything to everybody. I would strongly argue, focus, focus, focus. Go back to the SWOT. Think about what you're good at. Think about where the opportunity lies. Match what you're good at with the opportunity. Don't try to be good at the things you're not good at and do something completely different. Building your strengths. Recognize the role of the foundation sector is changing. In the UK, the foundation sector is becoming more and more important. That's not a good thing because government is withdrawing from many of the areas where we have funded. It's a bad thing. But actually in that context, foundations become more important. And for me, that says foundations have a responsibility to go beyond funding to try to influence the wider environment in which they work. Listen to those who fund. I haven't shared any of the data, but we do a huge amount of survey data with those who fund to ask them if we're doing any good. That's done anonymously with a third party, so it can help inform our own practice. For us, get that balance right between funding the organisation and supporting its organisational development. This 60-40 split for me is critical. You will work in value-driven organisations with staff and trustee members who come there, yes, because you pay them, or trustees probably not, but they come there because they like what the organisation does. I don't think strategy can work unless it's heavily owned. So I would say strategy is 60% ownership, 40% content. Seems an odd balance to take. Corporate alignment is really tough, but actually is the future. In the end, part of our ability to influence the wider environment is working with the corporate we work with. Have a strategy framework. It's not a straitjacket. You overspecify it. COVID has showed only too well that overspecified strategies have been thrown in the bin. But our strategy framework, as we see, has held us in good stead. So have a strategy framework. And recognize, and my staff tell me all the time, that all I do is change drive. Foundations are super tankers. Actually, you cannot stop them. For me, my job as chief executive is to be right at the front of the super tanker, making sure it's going forwards, even though some of my staff are saying, hang on a minute, can we just stay at the last port? I think they're so hard to turn around foundations because the change drivers are so entrenched. The conservatism in foundations is so entrenched, conservatism with a small c, that actually you need to keep driving around change and always asking, are you good enough? Where are you going to head next? So Rosa, I'm going to stop there with perhaps that slide as a prompt for some questions, because I'll stop, and I know in the second part we're going to move into COVID and people will have questions about too. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Rosa, to ask whatever you like. And I would encourage you to ask hard questions. I'm very happy to be asked hard questions. Ricardo, I think you're going to question me on this slot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for this first part. Now, I have up to now, no one has asked any questions, but I have one for you. I would like to know a little bit more about when you outline, listen to those you fund and act with for. How do you do that in practice? Because you are funding many people, you're acting with many people. How do you do that in an efficient way? Meaning, do you organize meetings, surveys? How do you listen to those you fund and act with?
It's a good question, and let me start from the top down in the way that we bring the voice of those we fund to our thinking. Our board meetings are always started with a 30-minute slot with a charity that we fund, which is them talking about what they do, how the foundation supported them, and gives trustees the opportunity to ask questions of them. So that's at trustee level to remind us that actually we're not there just to issue checks, we're there to fund real people, funding real organisations. And interestingly, given we're all using Zoom, we've always used a Zoom for those conversations with our grantees. They join the board for 30 minutes for that conversation. When we do our strategy work, we have strategy away days. Many of you will probably take your boards away for 24 hours, 48 hours. We always bring a good number of grantees into that conversation. They come as grantees, as equal participants alongside board members. We will ask 6 or 7, not 1 or 2, so they have some power. And they start very shy, as you would expect with our trustees, but they end up actually being quite demanding of us by the time we've got to 24 hours with them and we've had a drink with them in the evening or eaten with them. It becomes really important. It's a really important thing of getting the trustees connected. The second part is, as chief executive, I spend a lot of my time going out and meeting and talking to charities. My staff say, why are you doing that? It's not your job. Actually, for me, it's absolutely critical. If I cannot understand, feel, and understand what we're doing by visiting organizations and talking to them about what they're doing day to day, and critically the challenges they face, I can't be effective as a leader of the organization. And our staff do that. So I have half my staff who are located outside of London in the regions in which they work, and they manage a portfolio of 60 organizations, 70 organizations that they will build a relationship with and be in contact with very regularly. That kind of feedback. The fourth part for me is survey data. You asked if we do surveys. We do qualitative and quantitative surveys. We commission them from a third party. They will look at the whole of our grant making list, and we get a very good response rate. Critically, we ask people, not just those we've funded, we also ask those people we've rejected. How did it feel to be rejected by the foundation? Critically for us, with people reject, did you get good feedback? I am obsessed with giving people good feedback. We know that organizations get really upset about putting all their effort into a grant bid. They hear nothing back except you didn't get the grant. So I force my grant managers to give them really good feedback. You didn't get the grant because you could do this in order to improve your chances, really critically. But that survey data we do biannually, every other year. We've done now 4 of those. We've got 8 years of benchmark data. They ask people how we're doing. It looks about our processes. It looks about our customer support. It asks them questions about, should we be doing things beyond grant making? How did our Grants Plus work? Are you noticing our policy work? Are you content that actually we do policy work? Because if we do policy work, we can't give you a grant. We can't do both. So a really important part of what we do, Eduardo, driven by our strategy and our operating practice day to day, is that voice of the grantee to help to inform our work.
Okay, thank you, Paul. There is another question, and it is about impact measurement. Pilar Martin would like to know, how do you do that since you are funding such a large number of small NGOs, each one with a different method? How do you measure the impact on the people, not on the activities, when you are supporting such a diverse, heterogeneous NGOs? Do you propose anything to standardize? You let them free with the different measures, with flexibility? How do you approach this impact measurement on people?
That's a really good question, and we have shifted quite a lot in the new strategy. You will notice on one of the slides I showed, we were concerned that we were funding too much projects. And we've shifted away from funding projects to giving core unrestricted grants to organizations. Now, the issue with that is, so what do they report? Because they're not reporting an activity you're funding, you're funding the whole organization. So we've shifted in our impact reporting away from thinking about attribution to contribution. Now, I don't know if that translates to Spanish, but it's a fundamental change. It's effectively saying, don't report to us on that bit of your organization we funded with our project money. Report to us on what your whole organization is doing, and we will then say we have made a contribution to that. And what we also found out through our work was the danger in the project reporting approach was that they ended up feeling as though they were accountable to us. We don't want to be accountable to us. We want to be accountable to the person who's homeless who comes through the front door, or the refugee in Cardiff who needs their support. We want to be accountable to them. So we now say we want you to have outcome data, but we want to use the outcome data that you use with your board to hold yourselves accountable. Now, as a funder, that gives us a problem because we basically have 700 different ways in which that can be collected. So we try to advise and steer, and with our Funder Plus work, we provide a lot of support to help people through thinking about evaluation and how they can better improve their impact measurement. And there's a big demand for that. Charities really want that. And it's been really valuable as something we've offered them. But essentially, it's helping them to be accountable to those that come through the door. Because we want that impact to be measured, first of all, by the homeless people who come through the door. The question we want to ask is, do they feel any better? Are they in a better position as a consequence of what you've done? And to make and get organizations to focus on that does mean you've got to transfer the responsibility back to the organization and then use the data they collect and then think about the aggregation problem, which is our problem, not their problem, in how we add it all together.
Okay, good, excellent. Okay, since it's already 11:24, I think that you might as well continue. Otherwise, we're having a little time with the second part. Whenever you want, please. Okay,
we'll do. I just mentioned I'll comment briefly on it. We did. Somebody asked a question about Funder Plus. There is a really useful document, Eduardo, which I can send on to you, which you can link people into. It is that Funder Plus document I referred to, and I'll send it to you, Eduardo, with a hyperlink, and you can perhaps send it out. It's a summary of our 5 years learning, really, of how our Funder Plus work evolved, what we think has worked for us and what doesn't work for us that may be helpful for people. We have a lot more information on our website around Funder Plus too, so I will send you a hyperlink, Eduardo, but I'll move on to the second part, because when Rosa and I met, we thought, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that the world has fundamentally changed. Eduardo, is that slide full for you? Because on my slide, I'm on my picture, I'm only getting a third of it. If you can see it all, that's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. I see it well.
Fine. That's fine. Good. Okay, that's good. That's fine. So Rosa said, well, what are you doing now? So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what are we doing now to respond to COVID. And we've gone back to our strategy, interestingly, and I'll talk about how we've done that. I mean, the first thing we did was ask the question, what's the context? And what has changed? Well, what has changed is a significant shift in demand. You'll have seen exactly the same thing in Spain, or I'm sure people have had to move things online. Critically for us, business and service models have been really challenged because effectively, I must see if I can get the whole of this slide actually, because I can't see it all over there. Well, I probably remember what it says. So critically, demand has risen because a lot of the organizations we fund rely on two things. They rely on face-to-face contact with individuals to raise money and to provide services, and they rely on group work in order to raise money and in order to provide services. So they've had to really shift their business models. So that's changed significantly. And while completely new, a lot of that's been intensified by COVID. We see particularly the significance of the race and inequality agenda. I mean, Black Lives Matter, I'm sure it's in Spain too. It's been right in the face of us in Britain. But actually, it was there before Black Lives Matter made it an issue. Race has become a big issue because COVID has magnified the inequalities we already have in the country, not just around places where some places are poorer and have been historically for a long time, but also particular communities. And they've been affected by the double whammy. On the one hand, COVID and the disease, and the second, economic impact. The third point for us is that lockdown isn't, and you're seeing this already, we're looking at Europe and learning from you, it isn't an event, it's a process. It'll be some time before we get anything like to the world that we were in beforehand. So, now go back. So, what's changed? So, we went back to our SWOT, a really useful document, go back to it, ask the same thing again. What is it that's good about this? What are our weaknesses? And interestingly, this SWOT isn't awfully different than the one we had before. It lays with there, but it's a good founding to ask yourselves, well, actually, how should we respond? So we've decided that increasingly, because it's not an event, it's a process, we've thought of our response in chunks. And the first chunk for us was process up to the end of June, really, up to kind of now. What's been our immediate response? And the first thing we did was to ditch any requirements on our grantees to measure what they had been measuring before. We basically said, you may have been supporting long-term support for people who are homeless. We recognize that probably those homeless people now need food. They need basic shelter in order to keep themselves safe because they can't raise money because they can't beg. So we've been very flexible about all our grantees and said, use the money as you feel best, and we will consider reporting later. We've increased funding for 71 further organizations because we thought it would increase reach. We think that organization development offer is particularly important. We've developed quite a lot of new Grants Plus development offers. We've done some very focused work in 6 communities. We tried to influence the wider environment. We're doing quite a lot of lobbying to get the government to take account of the fact that charities have been a big part of the response and how should they respond. So that's been our initial response. So we're now thinking about what next. And I'm going to share with you these slides I used for my trustee board last week, actually. We went back to this. Well, that was what we were doing. What's still good? And again, I'll return to that in a moment and we can look at what's still good. Looking at our current strategy, 2 things became really clear to us. The first was that however COVID's going to unfold, there's going to be a big economic and social impact. And secondly, for us, because we're a corporate foundation and our own income is dependent on the bank's profitability, that's going to affect our own income. So those were really medium-term uncertainties, and we simply do not know enough about both those questions to properly determine our response for 2 to 3 years. So we will next year revisit our strategy, and we ask them that question: Are the board comfortable that we work with the strategy as it is at present, but actually look to revisit it entirely? And we will do that in 12 months' time. So we talked about what do we do in the next 12 months. But broadly, when we looked at our strategy, we thought that mix of funding, development, and influencing was right. Now, it'll be different for you, but my advice to you if you're thinking about COVID response would be to go back to your strategy before and ask where it's still relevant, but recognize that some of it might not be. I'll talk about that in a moment. Our assumptions going forward are, so as I mentioned earlier, for charities, their service and business models are going to be really challenged. They've had to go online. We don't think online is great for some clients, for many it won't be. Many of them are so financially challenged. We think there'll be significant voluntary sector charity collapse in Britain. So how do we respond to that? We think some of this impact on wider society will be long-lasting. It will affect some parts of the community more than others. And we think it's going to be very hard to challenge government. I mean, we are sadly still in the process of going through Brexit, and our government is determined to get out of Europe by the end of the year, whatever we might think. And that is going to really colour the government's approach to this. But actually, it's going to be hard to influence government, but equally, government wants answers because it doesn't have any. So there are opportunities there. So going forward, the challenges for us were that uncertainty is going to continue. We need charities to change, but not stop. We can't do it on our own. We need to collaborate with others. And we recognise that some charities that have been the most effective in terms of reaching poorer communities, particularly Black and minority ethnic communities, actually, we don't fund that many of them. So we've asked ourselves some questions. So we are going to change some of our approaches over the next 12 months. And on the right, we highlight what those some were. We will give grants for 2 years, not 3 years, because we're not sure we're going to survive, but we think 2 years will help more survive. We're going to deepen our development offer because we think organisations have to rethink their business models and rethink our influencing. And in terms of direct support, we're going to launch a program soon after the summer, which we've called our COVID cohort. We will give to the, we've already got 71 in that. We're going to add another 140 organisations. It will focus on particular complex social issues, but we're talking about setting ourselves a target of reaching at least a quarter of organisations being Black and ethnic minority led, not focused. We're going to flex some restrictions because we think that some organisations we should have funded, we're not able to fund. And on the right, we're going to focus on an organisation development support package, focus a lot on the relationship we have with the organisations that we fund and how we can use our strengths on that to develop and support them at what will be an incredibly difficult time for them. On our development influencing, we're going to use a lot of our work is building networks. What we recognise is that people are having to learn really, really fast. And they don't have a benchmark. None of us have done these services online before. We don't really know whether they will work. So we're going to do a lot of bringing people together in groups, grantee to grantee, funder to funder, to think about what we can learn from each other and learn quickly about what the new world will look like. We're going to continue to focus on some of those influencing priorities, the small to SNCs is small to medium-sized charities, domestic abuse. We have strengths in those areas. Domestic abuse has gone through the roof in Britain through lockdown. It will happen after lockdown. So we can rely on that. We can look at the benefit system that supports those out of work, where we have expertise. So we'll focus on some of those. We've seen in Britain the importance of infrastructure bodies, in understanding the context, in helping us to channel resources. So we think we may focus on those. We're going to do we're going to work in 6 places that we already have a footprint on and try to do some work on what might the future look with them, working with government bodies, local government bodies, police and crime commissioners in Britain, the health services, what might that look like? And we're going to look to collaborate. The ACF, which is our Spanish equivalent of you, our English equivalent, a British equivalent of you, it's brought together a collaborative hub that will help us, we think, to work together. We think we'll be a key part of that. So we've looked at, again, I think this is quite helpful. You can apply it to your context, it will be different. We've looked at what remains the same, what will we do more of, what are we flexing, what are we pausing. You will almost certainly have things that each of you would need to fit in those 4 columns. And that for us, I stole this document from another organisation. It's a model. It's a model for beginning to ask yourselves, given COVID, what are the things we're going to stop doing? Where might we need to do more? Where might we need to reflect? Where do we just pause? So as a template, I think it might be useful for people. And we've gone back to that document, and this is probably the 4th time I put this on. Interesting for us, some of the things in darker blue will emphasise a bit more. We're not going to be funding for longer because we've taken a strategic view. We want to reach more organisations rather than funding a smaller number for longer, which is where we might have been 3 years ago or 2 years ago. But in COVID, we think our reach becomes really important. And some final reflections that hopefully will lead us into some questions with Rosa is reflections for strategy in a post-COVID world. Can't do it all. Go back to strengths, focus. Think about how you can work together because there's a real issue here of duplication of effort. Organisations that need your support will be having to come to lots of you. They've probably got multiple applications. It's a waste of time. If you could bring that together and help it make it simple for them to apply to you, that's a good thing to do for you and for them, that you can reach people further and faster. You're going to have to make choices even more than you had before. Even more than before, we think strategy is going to need to be a framework. We talked about an agile strategy next year. we may actually decide we need another 1 or 2 year strategy because we're not clear enough on the medium term to make any sensible projections about where we might need to be in 3 years. And that for us means taking it in chunks, saying we know this bit's right. So for us, I talk a lot about agile strategy. We know the end point might want to be this. We have no idea how to get there, but we know what the first step is. So we'll take the first step and then the second step. And sometimes the step might be down, but hopefully more of them will be up and we'll get there. But the route there won't be a straight line. It's going to look like this, up and down, and especially in this kind of context. Don't let data paralyze your action. There's a danger that we all step back and say, we don't know enough. You know, we've got to wait for more information, more data. We've got to work with the data we have, but recognize it's not perfect. So they'll be able to flex. Speed. Get on with it. Looking out. We're now in a Corona supertanker. We have no idea where it's going. But I think as foundations, personally, and I think we all should feel blessed, that while many people are desperate to make a difference, we are in a blessed position in that each of us can make a difference. We can't fix it all, but for some people, post-COVID, we can make a big difference. And that's a delightful position to be in for foundations. And we feel proud, privileged, but also quite humble about that because it's a difficult thing to get right. And we know in doing it, we put a bid out for that adaptation grants. They're £5,000 to £15,000 each. That's up to €20,000. They're really modest proposals. We put a bid out to all our grantees, about 680 in the portfolio. We've had 450 bids back in the space of 2 weeks. They want £4.9 million sterling. We have half that. The needs are really basic. Things like perspex screens so they can go back to operation, rubber gloves so they can talk to clients again, hand sanitizer, really simple things, really modest propositions. And it's humbling that we have twice as many applications as getting able to fund. So the need is huge, and the need for us to respond quickly, but not to throw everything at it at once. We think, actually, we've seen the emergency. The greater need, the more difficult need, will be that plays out over the next 12 to 18 months. So I'm going to pause there, Rosa. I don't think it's too far out in terms of timing. I'm very happy to take any questions that people have as we draw to a close.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for taking us through this very deep and detailed explanation of what you do and how you're thinking about this. I feel that your humbleness about recognizing what is not known, it's something which is interesting to see in a big corporate foundation. So it is for me already a very good knowledge I'm taking with me. There's no questions yet, so I'd like you to maybe go back over. There are 3 aspects that I would like interesting for you to maybe go a little bit further on. One is organizational development and the help you're going to be giving charities about that. I think that probably reflects the idea of the huge changes, societies and charitable sector are going to go through, and it's now the time to help them to establish new models of operating, probably of getting money and so on. So I would be interested if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, on that specifically, organizational development. So, I mean, we're fortunate in that we've got 5 years of doing this. So we've got a track record, and it's quite hard to start from scratch. The one thing that's quite tricky about organizational development foundations is that when we did the research on this 5, 6 years ago about how to approach it, the strong lesson was that you should make it optional. If you make it compulsory, they will take it because they desperately need your money, and they will do whatever you ask of them in order to take your money. And that's completely understandable, but actually all the wrong reasons to be involved in organizational development. So fundamentally, we made it optional, and we developed a suite of things that started quite modestly and has now developed into a broad range, which actually takes up 10% of our grant making now. In terms of cost, it's probably 40% of our grant making time in terms of time spent with grantees to get it right. It's the hardest thing to get right. It's a suite of things we can offer. Now, I'm very happy to share with you where we're at with that, because I suspect that suite will be common to any country in Europe or that size of organization. Because when we look at other sectors, we fund social disadvantage. I can look at the arts sector and say 80% of the organizational development we support is just as relevant whether you're trying to run a small theatre in Birmingham or you're trying to run a homeless charity in London. They're very similar. They're the classic kind of thing that a McKinsey would do. They're all those things. The second thing we really learned was if you become the provider, you become the problem. Because how does the charity then tell you that what you provided is rubbish? So we don't provide any of it ourselves. We do the initial diagnostic ourselves, but we do not then provide any of it ourselves. We contract to it a range of third parties. So effectively, we've built a market, and it enables us to have market power because we can build and manage that market and improve it and also decommission it. If we get feedback from the charity to say we provided Rosa and Rosa was frankly really useless, we just stop using Rosa. If they said that Eduardo was fantastic, then we put all the work with Eduardo and we say to Eduardo, we've now given you 80 days work, we want a cheaper price. So it gives us that ability to really influence the market. So it's been optional. But actually going forward to COVID, we think it's different. And for the first time, we are going to offer grant making alongside development support. We want to see, and there's some risks in that. We will still hold to the purpose that it is not provided by us, it's provided by others. But we think we have so much to learn from foundations, from the those we fund, that so rapidly we need to learn it, that we need to see it as a learning objective shared with those we fund. So this 140 we fund, the proposition to them is, like you, we want to support as many organizations to think about what a new business model will look like, how you're going to raise money when you can't open your shop, you can't do your group activities, and you can't run your events where you're going to raise money, how you're going to provide a service when you can no longer bring your clients together in groups in the way that you had done. We're all thinking that through. Help us think it through together with your peers as a foundation. Come as learning partners, where we will put a learning partner alongside you, who you can partly commission, who will work with you up to a day, 2 days a month. We will fund that person. They will help you to think this through. They'll help you to come together with your peers, and they'll help you to come with us, so that in a year's time, we'll have a better idea of what these new service and business and models look like. And we will develop a more sophisticated offer. So fundamentally, I suspect a lot of the things we're providing before COVID will be the same as they were after, but it'll be a highly structured way with a big focus on rapid, fast learning, so that we can then project that back to those we fund and into our own thinking about where we next head.
Thank you very much. I don't see yet many more questions coming from the floor, if that is the right expression now when you're in a webinar. There's another thing which I find interesting, and it's the coordination with others and the funding. I think one of the things that is obvious is the need for information when you are funding, where the needs are, but also, as you say, not to overlap with others. How do you go about, especially now in the COVID time, when everything is happening so fast? Are you sharing with other funders what they are funding? Is there any way to make this kind of market more efficient?
That's a really good question, and there's a key role for foundations like yours, of course, as umbrella bodies in doing that. The ACF, which is our equivalent of the Spanish Foundation, is trying to bring together what we call a funder collaborative hub, which is going to be a place where funders can go. So I might be a smaller funder who works in, say, the north of England. I'm interested in who else is funding work with homelessness. Then it would be a conduit to where do I go, who do I speak to, how do I make the link fast. Now that's going to take us a while to build. So in the interim, it's crude, but actually what we've done, very good example, there's an infrastructure body that we support that supports very small infrastructure bodies around the country. It's called NAVCO, it's not what it's called in some respects. It needed an amount, it wasn't a huge amount actually, and basically I picked up the phone or emailed 4 or 5 of my peers, said we're prepared to put, I think for us it was £25,000 with it, will you match it? And we got a pool of £125,000 in 24 hours. So some of it's very rapid. But I think there is an onus on foundations like the Spanish Foundation to think about how they can help those who they support rapidly access others who they may want to work with. We have talked about pool funding. We will do some pool funding. We're going to put some pool funding into a refugee fund. And that refugee fund is led by, actually, in that case, an umbrella body from civil society of refugee charities. They have said this is our need. We will put a modest amount into that, and it will be up to them how it's best used. But strategically, we think it's often easier to align funding to pool it. So actually, even this morning, I was putting out an email around, I mentioned as I closed that 4.9 million and we have 2.5 million bids. I put out a note to 4 funders who I know have a similar footprint to us and said, we can only fund half of this. Would you align your funding with us? If they want, they can give us a 2.5 million, we can disperse it. But it doesn't really matter. If they say, well, actually, there are 440 organizations that need it, we'll pick up 100. We'll just give them 100 addresses and get them to fund it. And it's one application. So I think some of it is being really smart and fleet of foot, and the relationships that people will have on this call are really important. Is contacting those you trust, who you think they'll do a good job, and I can live with that with my board. But down the line, I think we need to be a bit more strategic on this, because what we'd like to see is a single application. And we've seen that with some funders coming together around a single application process, where funders look at it. There's a really good model, Rosa, and London funders, again, this is all stealable. London funders have done a really good job on this. It was London funders that led the process of everybody flexible. And they've now created a single portal where charities London can apply. The application is considered across a range of funders. Funders will say, well, I'll do that one, I'll do that one, I'll do that one, and just go and fund it. But those that fall out through there, they're then filtered into a pool, and then there's a pool resource, and London funders will say, well, can we just support them? The whole point is trying to take out the transaction costs, because we are all of us so obsessed with transaction costs that we're kind of fine a year and a half ago where it could take us 6 months to make a decision. If we wait 6 months for a decision, the organizations won't be there. So we've got to find, so the London funders model is a really good one, really worth looking at, and it absolutely will apply, because we should be stealing from each other in order to learn from each other. And if there are great models in Spain, we'd be happy to steal from you too, as long as somebody could translate.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good tip. Actually, we knew about the London funders because it was used as a base for the commitment that was launched by the EFC and Daphne. It was also a European-wide commitment to ask funders to be more flexible and certain criteria, and it was still, as you say, from London funders, and there are a few Spanish foundations that have already signed that commitment. But I think we should be looking a little bit more into this process that you have mentioned. I don't know if there's any other question from my fellow panelists, maybe Eduardo or Anna or Silvia would like to ask something directly to Paul.
Well, I don't have any questions, but since we have more time than I thought that we had, maybe you would like to develop a little bit on the question on the first part about what is included in your Funder Plus actions, what do you do and with who?
Yeah, talked about that a little bit in response to Rosa's comment, but it's I don't know if I can go back to. Can I go back to the slides? If there's a give back control. Okay, if I let me find the. Let me just flip through. There's a slide that shows this. Back actually. Yeah. Okay. So that's the range of support that we offer at the moment, and it's interesting, and it is demand led. So we provided packages to something like 800 organizations. And when I say a package might be any part of this. It might be the strategy piece, it might be the communications piece. All of these are provided by third parties. All of them are developed with the organizations that we fund. And, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it wasn't us that decided most of them needed strategy and planning. It was them that decided that. So demand has driven the scale a bit. Interestingly, very few of them want support around their services, and that for us absolutely is right. You know, it plays to our thinking that often these organizations we fund are expert at their services. They're not very good at running organizations, frankly. So the focus is, so if you look at those categories, all of the first four would be generic to any organization with a turnover less than $1 million in the UK and probably in Spain. You know, they want to think about strategy and planning, especially finance. They're usually hopeless at finance. What's a cash flow? You know, it's like this, you know, structures and systems, so all that stuff about contracts, monitoring, how do I be accountable, communications. They always start with a website. They always want to design a website, and we say, well, first of all, you need to decide what your focus is, what's your strategy. So, you know, they always want to improve the website. So often we will suggest that maybe they start with being clear about what they do. Governance, a lot of them have very weak governance models. They've got boards that have been there for 50 years sometimes, or boards that engage. Particularly at the moment, people are needing to engage their boards regularly, and some of these boards are very disconnected from their organization. So there's a huge onus on chief executives or directors of organizations. So that's the suite, Eduardo. And it is interesting how it's evolved through time and actually where the demand lies. And, you know, I would say that suite is probably as good in Spain or Germany as it is in Britain of things that people need. Of that size of organization, you know, these are small to medium-sized organizations. And the critical components for me is don't be the provider, commission it. This could be commissioned in groups. We've helped to develop markets that then other funders have used. There's an organization called the Cranfield Trust that does a lot of this. We've doubled the Cranfield Trust income with the work we've done. And the Cranfield Trust has now gone on to offer it to other funders. One of the risks, of course, is that we used to sometimes talk pejoratively about the risk is that grantees end up papering their walls with strategic plans that have been developed by different funders or with different funders' money. So one of the questions becomes, if everybody does that, how does it all coordinate? So one of the things we're trying to learn with the COVID cohort is how do we build this into more of a package? These might individually all look fine, but they work much better if they're an organization development package over a series of years where your website communications is absolutely linked back to your strategy and your governance too. So the key question is how do those all link together rather than be a series of different initiatives. And again, of course, what you need for this is a long-term relationship. This works really well if you're saying we're going to back you for 6 years. It works less well, and it's a challenge for us, this, is if you're only going to fund them for a year. Because you're not going to fix their strategy in a year. But moreover, if they think you're only going to fund them for a year, they'll never be honest about their problems. And you only start with knowing where to focus by then saying, look, we're really good at what we do. We deliver great domestic abuse services, but our strategy is really poor and our fundraising doesn't work. You know, you've got to get to that level of honesty before we can begin to think about how best to support them. So hopefully that slide's helpful, Eduardo.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so is there anyone? No more questions? Okay, so thank you very much for excellent presentation, a lot of knowledge. This is an example of how all these limitations of movement that have come with this crisis are not a problem for the exchange and flows of knowledge. And we have to keep on collaborating internationally, exchanging ideas, flows of knowledge, thanks to technology, because collaboration is key to survival, to finding new solutions. And here you have brought us a lot of knowledge on how you're approaching this problem, this crisis brought about with COVID-19 in your foundation, a very good corporate foundation. And I'm sure this will help and offer a lot of value to Spanish foundations. So thank you. I go to the transition to Spanish now. Gracias a todos los que os habéis apuntado por la confianza. Gracias también a Ana, Lovenberg y a Anesbat por el apoyo, Rosa, Silverio y también el apoyo técnico de CAMS. Esperemos que esto sea la primera de una serie larga. Este año en concreto vamos a programar otra para octubre. Os mandaremos la información de cuál en concreto en septiembre. Y repetir que lo que dije al principio, esta presentación y la grabación la enviaremos en 2-3 días, a principios de la semana que viene, a todos los inscritos, de forma que el que no haya podido asistir en directo se pueda beneficiar en diferido. Y nada más. Bueno, hasta la próxima.
Muchas gracias.
Okay.